unknown events and connections mixed with what appears to be some extra-dimensional or spiritual influence.
Sure. I mean, that is really the overarching theme. What are the sinister forces? We find in history, in American history, that people have literally blamed sinister forces for the things that have gone on. I took the title from Al Haig. Alexander Haig had said that the sinister forces were responsible for that 18.5-minute gap on the Oval Office tapes. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective. What are those sinister forces? Al Haig at one point was running NATO. He was our national security advisor. At one point, Al Haig was trying to take over the White House when Nixon was considered to be either too ill or in the midst of the possibility of impeachment. So here's one of the most powerful people in the United States government, in the 1970s, talking about sinister forces. And I thought that's interesting. And then, of course, we had Douglas MacArthur talking about sinister forces coming from some other planetary galaxy, and screwing with us. So I wanted to know what those were. What did people mean by that? And like most Americans in the 20th century, when I started, we came out of this environment where science was everything. Science was perfect. Science had the answers to all of it.
Right.
But science, for me, only answered, half of the equation. There's something else that's, essential to the human experience. And science is great for analyzing material phenomena, but it's not very good in answering the big cosmic questions. Why are we here? And, what is our purpose? Do we have a purpose? Life after death, and, thousands of other things. So I started to look more deeply. What does religion and spirituality have to say about reality itself? What does it have to say about the world that we're living in? Does it answer things that science doesn't? And I found traces of this all throughout American history, focusing just on American history and sinister forces. I found that there was a thread running through our history where events that seem to be unrelated are actually deeply related to each other. And the connective tissue is usually something so totally bizarre and so totally off the wall that, of course, we ignore it. We ignore it because we don't know how to confront it. It's a little bit like the UFO experience,
Right.
We have to ignore it because we can't explain it. Since we can't explain it, we ignore it. And because we're ignoring it, we can't explain it. It's catch-22.
Yeah.
But that's where we are. So we've relied so much on science to answer questions for us that we are neglecting an entire aspect of what it is to be human. And in some cases, by doing that, we've ignored connective tissue that exists between political events and political actors that, quite frankly, I found totally baffling and totally shocking. I don't even know where to begin with sinister forces, but we talk about coincidence. Coincidence is a very unscientific term, but science will use that term when it can't explain what happened. So take, for instance, the Texas Tower shooting, right? In Texas, University of Texas, a guy goes up to a tower and starts shooting people. Eventually, a police captain is brought in. The shooter is captured and killed. All kinds of things happen surrounding this particular event. But people didn't realize that this entire episode had been prefigured in a novel that was published years before, which even got the name of the police captain right, even though he wasn't even in the police department at the time. So what was that all about? How did that happen?
Right.
It's okay to have like a general idea. Some nut goes onto the top of a tower and starts shooting people. I guess, eventually some novelist would have to come out with that. But to get the name of the police captain right, that's absurd. Okay, that's insane. So that prompted me to look further. And naturally, the ties to the Kennedy assassination was the next step in this process of me looking at that and thinking, oh, no, this is not possible. These people could not have been involved. No, wait a minute. Who's this? And connecting the dots, as you said, there's a lot of dots out there, but when you start connecting them, it gives you a different picture of reality. It gives you a different picture of what's going on. Like you mentioned, a kind of quantum approach to history. And I always ask people, was the Kennedy assassination a particle or a wave? It depends upon how you look at it. Was there a conspiracy or not? You can make a very good case that there was no conspiracy whatsoever, which is what the Warren Commission did. with voluminous documents and piles of paperwork. But at the same time, you can make a very good, almost, I would say, airtight case that there was definitely a conspiracy involved. But you're not going to like the details.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the details of that conspiracy involve things that we generally ignore and we don't want to look at. And it involves spirituality. It involves weird churches. It involves a bunch of people thinking they were in contact with a UFO in Maine in 1952. You know, it has all of these connective threads, and they all point directly at the assassination. How is that possible? And when I started looking at that, and you know, I began to stop and say, okay, let's look at history. Let's just focus on American history, because this phenomenon is true for all history, basically around the world. But let's just start with American history and see where it leads us. And that, you know, led to Sinister Forces. It's 3 volumes, you know, and as you mentioned, it's pretty dense.
Yeah.
You know, I have to apologize for that, but that was the only way to really make a case, was to pile on the evidence the way the Warren Commission did.
Yeah.
You know, you got to do the same thing and use their tools against them, essentially, and say, okay, we're going to take a Warren Commission approach to this. Let's just pile in the documentation. Show me, you know, where it's wrong. Maybe you don't like my interpretation or the spin that I put on these things. But if you just look at the documents themselves, there's nothing you can do to disavow it.
Mm-hmm.
We did have a bunch of people meeting in the woods in Maine in 1952, you know, having a seance, contacting a saucer that was hovering over the planet. And 10 years later, these same people are involved in the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. I mean, directly involved in the Kennedy assassination, you know, not sort of really weird peripherally. This one knew that one, knew this one, knew that one. I'm talking about 2 handshakes away.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable. It's very trippy. And I do want to talk about those threads in JFK and the seance, but let's just back up for a bit, because the Sinister Forces trilogy, it covers so much ground, and one area that really blew my mind was just all the relics and the evidence of a rich pre-Columbian history that our culture really refuses to acknowledge. And to quote the first book in the series, you say, "There is an ancient America that lurks beneath the threshold of our collective corn-fed consciousness." And I really love that. I think you're spot on. And it's also interesting, if you put any stock in the idea of spiritual forces influencing particular places or areas geographically, it would be pretty important to learn the pre-Columbian history, yet we know very little. But, you know, of the things that you've learned about this ancient America, what have you found most interesting?
Well, the fact that you can look at our continent, at North America, with the same wonder that you can look at the Middle East, for instance, Egypt or Mesopotamia or Stonehenge in England, or the vast temples in Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras. I mean, North America is replete with ancient monuments. And because they were made of earth instead of being made of stone, we kind of didn't see them for a long time. Some people did, and some people made drawings of them, and they excavated there totally amateurishly, probably ruined a lot of data, ruined a lot of information that way. But there's no doubt that we had ancient civilizations in the North American continent, and they were capable of just the same degree of sophistication in creating their earthworks as the Egyptians were in building their pyramids. As an example, they were just as capable. In fact, some of the mounds, because they were a mound-builder culture, they just built earthen mounds. Some of the mounds are actually larger and have more volume than the pyramids of Egypt, than the Great Pyramid. We're talking about people who are very sophisticated. The serpent mound is a good example of an astronomically oriented earthworks. The people had the same ideas about adjusting their life and building their life around cosmic cycles. All of this was there. They just simply didn't leave much in the way of writing behind. But they did develop this very active civilization. And I was drawn to this accidentally. I had absolutely no knowledge of it, like most Americans. You walk over these mounds not knowing that you're walking over the remains of an ancient civilization. And I was drawn to it through accident. I was researching Charles Manson, of all things. So I decided to go to Charlie's hometown, basically. The birth certificate says he was born in Cincinnati, but he grew up in Ashland, Kentucky. So I said, okay, let me go there. I just want to see the environment. Manson was kind of the touchstone for all of this, because Manson seemed to combine in himself a lot of these same elements that I was concerned about. I mean, he was Scientology clear, on one hand. He was responsible, of course, for the Manson family murders on the other, but there was so much other stuff going on. He was at, Boys Town, for crying out loud. He was in all sorts of places. And I just wanted to see it for myself. So using Manson as kind of the way into the story about American history, I drove down from Rhode Island, where I was living at the time, and all the way down to Ashland, Kentucky, and realizing that so many towns in West Virginia and Kentucky and Northern Virginia were homes to some of the world's most, or some of our country's most infamous serial killers. And I thought, well, that's something weird right there. Let me just soak in the atmosphere, see what this is all about. Maybe it's the water, So I drove to Ashland, and, right in the middle of the town where Charles Manson grew up, went to school when he went to school, and all the rest of it, is a park. It's called Central Park. And in the middle of the town, there are these Indian burial mounds. I mean, they're large enough that, they're quite visible. They're quite, obvious. And there was a plaque there saying that, the mounds were actually excavated by a Boy Scout troop or some damn thing. And I'm thinking, what is this all about? So I start researching the mounds. And as I'm researching the mounds, I become aware of the Adena culture, this ancient culture that was there in that part of the world, that was very concerned with religious rituals surrounding these mounds. And I'm thinking, wow, Charlie grew up playing on these mounds, playing on the remains of the civilization, mounds that were used either for burial or they were used for religious purposes, aimed at the stars or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm crawling over these mounds myself. I'm saying, what is this all about? And then I noticed there's this strange house. It's a huge brick house. And on the top of the house, there are these two cherubim. There's two cherubs, like you find on top of the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And these are on top of the roof of this house. And I'm thinking, well, that's bizarre. And they're really weird looking eldritch sort of figures, They're griffins or something. And they're very strange. And they're positioned like they would have been on the Ark of the Covenant. And the two angels on the Ark are the mercy seat. God was supposed to come down and sit in the middle of that. And I'm thinking, let me research this a bit more. And evidently they moved this house entirely, the entire vast house. This is not a small building. This was a big apartment house when I was there. They moved the entire thing so that it would be kind of in line with these burial mounds. And I'm thinking, how weird is this? This is Ashland, Kentucky. This is Chuck Woolery's hometown. This is Naomi Judd's hometown.
Yeah.
I mean, what is this all about? And, that started me off on this whole thing. What are the mounds about? What is the association? And then I found that there were mounds involved underneath some of our biggest prisons in the Midwest. In Moundsville, West Virginia, is where Squeaky Frumpy was, one of Manson family's members, her most prominent member, perhaps, after the ones who were arrested. She was arrested for the attempted assassination of Gerald Ford, Squeaky, and she wound up in a prison on top of one of the other mounds. Henry Lee Lucas, very famous killer, was incarcerated in Chillicothe, Ohio, on top of another burial mound. There was this association of burial mounds with prisons in American consciousness. Somehow we did that, whether deliberately or accidentally. So I began to wonder, what is the meaning of this? Are we, is America, as I say in Sinister Forces, is it a haunted house? Are we living in a haunted house? Are there ghosts here, in a sense, from civilizations long past that we've been ignoring? And could that be, an element of our consciousness as human beings? Are we, in a sense, kind of possessed or haunted by these ancient civilizations that we've basically trashed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really fascinating study with a lot of connections that I had never heard before, and it does make you think, because like you say in the book, Native Americans, there's an area of West Virginia where they have legends, don't go there. This area where the Mothman flare-up happened. And it
exactly
makes you think about spirits and entities and maybe a subtle possession of sorts. And yeah, it's very trippy, but maybe we're not as in control as we always think we are.
No, I think we're in control, of some of the things that we do, but I think our motivations are quite often unconscious, that we don't know why we're doing the things that we do. And I think that's part of the problem. We don't know why. We don't have a connection to this land. to this territory. The way people in other countries, have connection to their territory. They identify with their land, with their landmarks, with their history going back hundreds, thousands of years. We are a transient population, basically. We've come from everywhere with no direct connection to our land, to the territory we're living in.
Yeah.
The people who lived here before, we basically slaughtered as much as we could, or they existed and dropped out of sight even before the Native American populations as we know them showed up. So there's something going on here. We're not as connected. We're kind of adrift on this landscape. And our only points of tension sometimes are these weird, bizarre architectural, geographical phenomena that we don't know anything about, that we just build our houses on top of. We unconsciously kind of understand this. If we look at American filmmaking over the last 20, 30 years, there's this idea that we build houses on Indian burial grounds.
Yeah. Right.
It was there in The Shining, a very good example, or it was there in Poltergeist.
Mm-hmm. Pet Cemetery.
There you go. And the other film with John Cusack, the one where all these different personalities are inhabiting this motel, there are these allusions constantly to an Indian burial ground, which is never discussed anymore in the film. It just happens to be there. There's brochures in the motel saying, this is an Indian burial ground. I think the film was called Identity.
Yes.
So there's this idea that there's a connection between the burial grounds and our weird behavior, and I think this is something that's really worth looking into.
It is. And of course, when you talk about the founders of America, we know a good chunk of them were Freemasons and they have their own esoteric beliefs and practices. And then we start reading about their interest in alchemy and ceremonial magic. And we've had people write huge books on the geomancy and occult symbolism of Washington, D.C. When you look at it, there's a lot missing in the official story here, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. Because we're talking about what I think it was James Webb called rejected knowledge. Mm-hmm. And even though it's rejected, it was still there. We can say that, there's nothing to alchemy, that was superstition. But, the governor of Connecticut in the 17th century had a huge library of alchemical works, more than 250 volumes on alchemy. You didn't even know there were that many books on alchemy, right?
Right.
But he had 250 books on it. Cotton Mather, who was present at the Salem witchcraft trials, was learned in alchemy. He had friends in the Royal Society who were alchemists. There was a lot of correspondence going back and forth on this subject. Of course, Isaac Newton was very involved in alchemy through all of his life. So it was part of being educated, was to be educated in these ideas. We had alchemy, we had governors, and we had people prominent in religious life and in political life in our country in the 17th and 18th centuries who were extremely involved with alchemy, but also with ideas like ceremonial magic, which, according to some authors, was not quite that different. Cornelius Agrippa, one of the most famous magicians who wrote books of occult philosophy, the 3 books of occult philosophy, wrote extensively about ceremonial magic. But what was not so well known was that he was also a practicing alchemist, and an alchemical laboratory went with him wherever he went. Huh. So there's this crossover between alchemy as a kind of pseudoscience, the way it's described today, as a forerunner to alchemy, which it was not. Alchemy had its own reason for being. It had its own character. It was it's hard to say it was a spiritual practice the way we understand it today, because we've compartmentalized so much information to the point where nothing's related to anything else anymore. But to those people back in the Enlightenment era, everything was connected. Everything was an iteration of something else. You could use religion to discuss science. You could use science to discuss religion. There was not that strong a demarcation between all of them. So alchemy then became, for me, because I've written about alchemy a lot recently, is a very scientific approach to the idea of consciousness. It was basically a consciousness science that said you have to use all the tools available to you as a human being to understand what reality is. And once you do that, you can cause change to occur in the material world. And that's what alchemy was about. It was about going backwards in space and time to the point where the universe was created and understanding that process and then bringing it forward. It's a very sophisticated approach to understanding reality. And we've kind of thrown it out because it's not chemistry,
Yeah.
it's not physics, but it was chemistry, physics, biology, and a lot of spirituality, what you might call spirituality, psychobiology, let's call it, all mixed in together, a very advanced kind of knowledge. And we rejected it. By the time of the 19th century was coming around, the only people who were focused on that would be people who were creating religious cults. So you had Joseph Smith, also very involved in studying alchemy, the man who created the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints of the Mormons. He was conducting rituals in New York, basically using Agrippa's formulas, magic circles, wands, lamps, incense, the whole thing, trying to contact spiritual forces. And that was the origin of, the Book of Mormon. So jump forward 100 years, and you have L. Ron Hubbard doing the same thing in the California desert with Jack Parsons, using the same rituals that Joseph Smith was using.
Man.
So, this is the American religious experience has its roots in ceremonial magic.
Yeah, it definitely does. And you see all these allusions to it early on, but what do you think about these beliefs and traditions? Are they still intact among parts of the political elite in this country?
Oh, I think they are. We have a kind of a problem in our country, the way we understand things. We know legally in the Constitution there is separation between church and state. That's a legal thing, right?
Yeah.
Where Congress can make no law affecting religion, right? So that's fine. But that doesn't mean that our politicians have no religion. Our politicians, America is one of the most religious countries on the planet. And people don't realize that. If you've traveled abroad a lot, if you travel to Europe is not a religious country. They have a lot of religious architecture. They got a lot of churches and stuff like that. But the people themselves are basically not religious.
Right.
They're not that religious, right? They're amazed at America, at our obsession with religion in this country. So you have politicians, you have political leaders who hold very strange beliefs and who don't talk about those beliefs except in the most general way. Oh, I believe in Jesus or something just to make everybody happy.
Yeah.
But basically what they really believe is sometimes is very strange. And we're electing these people and putting them in positions of power where they may, act in accordance with these very strange beliefs. Ronald Reagan was one of them. Reagan belonged to the same denomination, the same religious sect that Jim Jones belonged to, the guy who was responsible for Jonestown and the Guyanese massacre. They belonged to the same denomination. It was an apocalyptic denomination, an end of times focus. That we're living in the end of times. The world's about to be destroyed. We're a breath away from mutually assured destruction. And we elect this guy as president of the United States who goes up against the Soviet Union. In his heart of hearts, what was he thinking? Was he thinking, oh, hell, if the world ends, that's fine because that's the way Jesus wanted it?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Right.
Can we vote on this by any chance? And this is, we have this. Those are the obvious examples, like Ronald Reagan and Jim Jones being co-religionists, if you will. But there's other more subtle ideas as well, and Freemasonry is one of those things that exists everywhere in government. We have had so many presidents who were Freemasons, and not just minor level Freemasons, but high level ranking Freemasons. Gerald Ford, being one of them, just to bring him back up again.
Right.
Here was a guy who was, high up in the Masons. We've had senators and congressmen, and people will say, well, it's like a boys' club. Yeah, except that it's a boys' club with magical rituals,
Right.
with ritual initiations. And it's not the kind of initiation you might find at a hazing, at a frat house someplace. This is some serious stuff.
True.
This is memorizing huge amounts of text that you have to recite. This is going through really spooky rituals. Just the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry alone are talking about, sort of death and resurrection, and a very spooky sort of ceremony. And then you start adding the other degrees on top of it, the Rosicrucian degrees and the Knights Templar degrees and all of this. And you are bringing in not only the consciousness altering rituals themselves, but you're bringing in a whole kind of weird history that connects that American politician with ancient Egypt, with the Temple of Solomon, with the Knights Templars who were, suppressed by the Catholic Church and massacred, with the Rosicrucian Society. You're building a whole different historical frame of reference that is outside the mainstream.
Right.
That regular historians don't write about. They don't see a timeline connecting all of these events.
Yeah.
But that is exactly what a Freemason of those high degrees would have to, if not believe, they've been exposed to it in a very emotionally charged way.
Yeah, definitely a worthwhile thing to draw some attention to. And, if we're going to talk about occult influences in early America, you had mentioned the Salem witch trials. They're worth a mention for several reasons, but talk to us about this saga and how it might be connected actually to the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, it is very strange, I think. We were taught in school, or I was anyway, back in the 20th century, back many decades ago. We were taught, Salem witchcraft trials. It was hysteria. It was like basically the McCarthy era, which was referred to, of course, as witch trials also. In the 1950s is when I was going to school. Sorry about that, but that's true. And it was the time of the McCarthy era, right? So, we were looking for communists. It was like looking for witches. It was the same thing. And believe me, I've gone through this a number of times already, and now we're in a similar situation today. So in those days, it was communists on the one hand. You had Arthur Miller writing The Crucible, which was a metaphor for what was going on. And we were taught that there were no witches in Salem, that this was all trumped up, that this was people getting hysterical and blaming each other for things, and a bunch of teenage girls going nuts, and there was nothing to it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there was witchcraft in Salem. There was alchemy. There was ceremonial magic throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the Providence plantations and all of that, all the way going to Connecticut. There were practices of that nature. We're pretty sure that at least one or two of those accused in Salem were actually practicing occultists of some kind. That's what modern scholarship has demonstrated.
Wow.
There is sufficient evidence that there was witchcraft going on there. Now, whether Tituba, the slave, was actually involved in it or not is a different story. There was two different streams or currents of occult practice taking place in that part of the world. One was the European-centered occult practices that we already talked about, ceremonial magic, Agrippa, alchemy, and all of that. And then there was what Tituba represented, which was a kind of native Caribbean type of magical practice. So you had two streams running, and they kind of collided in Salem. Tituba, when I was a kid in school, they kind of made Tituba appear to be a black woman, an African-American slave.
Mm-hmm.
And she wasn't. She was an Arawak Indian. She was from the Native American race. She was enslaved down there in the Caribbean. She was bought by one of the people, the minister who was running Salem, the Salem Church at that time, and brought up to Massachusetts. That's a weird connection right there. There weren't that many Arawak left. They had been slaughtered for the most part after Columbus, when there were uprisings and all of that, and the Arawak were gone after very viciously by the Spanish in that part of the world, by the conquistadores. So you didn't have many Arawak left, but Tituba seems to have been one of them. There's been some good scholarship on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems as though her ethnic origins go back to Guyana, which of course is where we have the Jonestown massacre a little bit later. So I'm not saying there's a direct connection, but it's a very suggestive one.
Right.
I call it Tituba's revenge, But anyway, so, or maybe it's cigarette smoking, is because that was an Arawak thing too. But Tituba then is in Salem, and when she's being questioned, and remember, Tituba started all of this, right? It was Tituba's talking about voodoo dolls, right? Making puppets to affect other people through sympathetic magic that supposedly started this whole Salem thing. Tituba was not executed at Salem. She lived a long life after Salem. She was thrown in prison. She was eventually released when the governor of Massachusetts got disgusted with the whole thing and said, enough is enough, because now you've claimed my wife as a witch. Okay, we've gone far enough here, boys and girls. So she was released, actually. I think she got married and went on her merry way, which is one of the things we don't hear about Tituba. But when she was being interrogated, and she was being interrogated about how she went to the meetings of the witches, the kind of occult rituals they would perform and all the rest of it, she kept referring to the man in black. It would be the man in black who would come to fetch her. The man in black was the messenger. He was the person who brought people to the witchcraft ceremonies, such as they were, whether they were sabbats or esbats or however they defined them in those days. Tituba claimed it was the men in black who were doing this. I was startled to find that reference in a document, going back to 1692.
Yeah.
It's very, very bizarre.
It is.
But there she is talking about the men in black, 1692, 1697, up to that point of time. And, the idea of witches flying through the air, the idea that they could, dematerialize in one place, materialize someplace else, sort of a manifestation of quantum entanglement somehow, or non-locality. These very sophisticated ideas are coming out of Tituba. And the man in black, motif then would be forgotten for maybe 200 years or almost 300 years after Tituba, and it would only reappear again in the 1940s, 1950s, where the men in black then suddenly show up around the time of UFO experiences, and they're there they dress in black, they show up, they question, witnesses, and they disappear. And they're always a little bit out of sync with everyone else. They're driving cars that are, 20, 30 years older than, modern vehicles, and they're dressed oddly and all the rest of it.
Right.
And Tituba declared that these men in black would dress oddly. They were in black clothes, but they were not period clothes of that period. I mean, there was enough information there that led me to believe that maybe she was talking about something very real, that maybe there was a real experience behind Salem. Academics will say, well, there were economic issues involved. There was this, no, that's probably true. But there was a triggering event. There was something really deep behind it. The idea of spectral evidence, where a girl could go hysterical in the courtroom and claim to see a devil, bothering somebody or possessing someone else. And of course, no one else saw it. Cotton Mather himself eventually got disgusted with the whole thing and said, this is wrong. And Cotton Mather was quite a conservative Christian, let us say. But when it came to the Salem witch trials, he threw up his hands and said, it's not real. But nobody said that Tituba was lying. Nobody claimed that Tituba had made anything up. The girls, yes, probably, for the most part. But there were some people who were arrested at Salem who were involved in occult practices, and of that we know now to be true. Therefore, did these occult practices involve things that we would consider today to be UFO related?
Yeah. Another interesting parallel is bruises and marks on the body. That jives with the UFO abduction phenomenon too. I found that pretty interesting.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. There was, the idea that there might have been implants, there might have been body parts or, surgeries taking place on people. There was definitely there's a motif that runs through history. And it didn't start at Salem. It started, of course, much, much earlier on. But we see this motif everywhere. We see it in the sacrifices of the Aztecs in Mexico. We see this concept that your organs are not really your own, that they belong to the gods, and the gods can come and collect them at any time. And therefore, to forestall the gods coming back and wreaking havoc, we're going to select our own sacrifices. We're going to kill people and offer up their organs to the gods, which keeps the gods away from the rest of us. I've been doing a lot of research on that lately. And I'm reading deeply into the Aztec annals and the Popol Vuh and everything else coming around from the Maya and even the Inca records. And if you look at it from the point of view that this could be part of that same phenomenon, then suddenly it all starts to make sense. There's a recurring motif throughout world literature that seems to be that our blood is not our own, that our organs not our own, that we ourselves are not our own. We don't actually own ourselves. We're not as autonomous as we think we are. And what is the reason for that? Why do we think that? Why do so many cultures have that belief? And in the Aztec case, they were terrified by this. People would willingly, voluntarily offer up their blood, to various shrines. They would pass a shrine on the road to an Aztec god, and they would open their veins, and offer some of their blood to that shrine before going on. This was the concept they had. And to me, that's fascinating from the point of view of genetics and evolution. What does this all mean? Is there a genetic connection to this? And what is it? So That's kind of the work I've been doing these days.
That is an interesting thread too. But yeah, so many flare-ups throughout history. It becomes more and more apparent we might just be playthings for the gods, playthings for these sinister forces. And I'm really interested in the belief systems of the elite, their experiences with ceremonial magic, and really just how much contact with otherworldly entities there could be and how that influence could spread across the culture. So the story of the Nine is really amazing. It's probably the best example that there is meat on those bones, and you cover it so well. Can you tell us a little bit more about this farmhouse seance and some of the elite families that were there?
It sounds pretty weird when you put it that way, doesn't it?
It does.
That old farmhouse seance. You had this sort of American Gothic idea of a couple of people in overalls and a pitchfork, but actually it was totally different. And it is, I think, the best example of this. And a man called Andrija Puharich wrote about it very famously. I mean, he was not bashful about talking about this. That's why it's so well documented, and yet nobody put the two and two together. Andrija Puharich was a American-born scientist of Yugoslav background. He was a medical doctor. He was an entrepreneur. He experimented with scientific devices and that sort of thing. And during the Korean War, he was, I believe, he had the rank of major in the U.S. Army, but he was based out of Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, which was, of course, where the chemical biological warfare stuff was conducted. And he gave a talk to the military, to the Defense Department personnel, on weaponizing psychic abilities. This is totally documented. It's there. We have names, addresses, and phone numbers. He went there and gave that talk. He was very much involved in the study of paranormal phenomena, and he was a friend of Henry Wallace, who at one point was Vice President of the United States, Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt. Henry Wallace, of course, was a friend of Nicholas Roerich, who was the famous Russian psychic and artist and medium who, went on vast travels through Tibet and Asia and places like that, and had actually seen a UFO back in the 1920s or 1930s, I believe. So this Andrija Puharich, as I say, was fascinated with the paranormal, fascinated with psychic abilities. And he gathered around himself a group of friends and fellow travelers, you might say, that he called the Round Table Foundation. And he had a seance. This was in 1952. Remember, 1952 was the year of the great UFO overflight in Washington, D.C. in July of that year. Well, a little later on, Puharich has the seance. And the person who was the medium was a Dr. Vinod from India, who was a very prominent, actually, member of some of the world religious organizations. And I was in contact with the family a few years ago because I was desperately trying to find out more about this guy. And they were insisting he wasn't a medium at all, but he was very religious. For some reason, he acted as a medium with Puharich. And as a medium, he had conducted the seance to which a very strict number of people was invited. And the people who were invited involved Arthur Young, who was one of the inventors of the Bell helicopter during World War II. After the war, he dropped out of the engineering business and went straight into full-time research on the paranormal. Arthur Young and his wife. His wife is Ruth Forbes Payne Young, which is a lot of nomenclature there, but I'll explain that in a bit. Also, there was a DuPont and an Astor, members of the DuPont family and the Astor family. We had basically a blue blood American royalty sitting around a seance table, in the forest in Maine. And they were allegedly, according to Puharich himself, they were contacted by a group calling itself the Nine that was evidently living on a spaceship hovering over the planet. And they were proving their existence and their intelligence by solving a mathematical equation for Puharich, which he later verified was true. And then they went on to discuss, plans for the planet, how the people have to get together and solve some of these problems, and that the 9 people sitting at that table were the 9 who were just like them, called the 9. There were 9 astral entities, or whatever you want to call them, extraterrestrials, and there were 9 humans. And those 9 and the 9 on the ground were now united. They were linked. And the 9 people on the ground should go out and, conduct themselves accordingly and cause change to occur in the world in general.
Damn.
They had their marching orders from this spacecraft entity speaking through an Indian medium. And they took this seriously. Okay. This was a very serious thing that they did. Arthur Young and his wife, of course, the rest of their lives were involved in paranormal research. Arthur Young wrote a number of books. He understood that beyond the scientific ideas of the time, there was one that was neglected, which was the scientific idea of the process of how things happen. He had a 7-stage process formula that he used. He wrote the geometry of meaning. He wrote the theory of process. He was very involved in that, kind of combining, metaphysical ideas with science. That was Arthur Young's forte. One of the DuPonts became very prominent in other psychological and spiritual organizations. The Astor herself was related to the famous Astor family of the Waldorf Astoria. She had a lot of connections to occultism and occult practices also. And the list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm.
That's 1952. Arthur Young, as I said, is married to Ruth Forbes Payne Young. That's because Forbes was her maiden name. This is the same family that gave us John Kerry, right? This is the Forbes, Forbes magazine. It's the same Forbes family.
Right.
This famous, wealthy, influential family. She's part of that. She married a guy called George Lyman Payne, who was a Trotskyite out of California. She divorced him and then married Arthur Young. But she had a son by her previous marriage to George Payne, and that was Michael Payne. Now, Michael Payne got a job through Arthur Young working for Bell Aerospace in Texas, because Arthur Young still had tremendous connections at Bell. So now Michael Payne, who was seems kind of a lazy ne'er-do-well mostly, gets this kind of cushy job down in Texas, in Dallas. And he's married to another Ruth. He's married to Ruth Payne. And Ruth Payne wanted to study Russian. She was a Quaker. She studied folk dancing. She was into a lot of different things. And at one point, she was introduced to Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald, introduced by George de Mohrenschildt. Now, all of you Kennedy researchers know exactly who I'm talking about in this discussion. Ruth Payne opened her home to the Oswalds. Marina Oswald lived with Ruth Payne for a while. The idea is Ruth would teach her Russian. That, for some reason, Ruth Payne was desperate to learn Russian, which was an uncommon language to be obsessed about in 1963. And at any rate, so she's living there with the kids and everything else. And Ruth Payne is the one who helps Lee get his job at the Texas School Book Depository.
Wow.
Ruth is also the one who basically gives all the evidence necessary to hang Lee Harvey Oswald to the Dallas police. She has stuff in her garage that belongs to Lee, and she gives him up, basically. They are members of the ACLU, she and her husband, Michael Payne. They don't arrange for a lawyer for Lee Oswald, even though Lee is asking for a lawyer in one of his television things after he was arrested. They don't bother to move an inch to get him a lawyer. And later, of course, there's a famous photograph of Marina Oswald, Marguerite Oswald, Lee's mother, and Ruth Payne sitting in Ruth Payne's home, with the Dallas police and the FBI, and they're, spilling their guts basically on this whole thing. About 2 months before the assassination, Ruth Payne, out of Texas, goes on vacation, and she goes up to Philadelphia and hangs out with Arthur Young and his wife, Ruth. We don't know what was discussed. We don't know what she had a Russian defector living in her house, right? How many Americans had Russian defectors living in their house in 1963? I can tell you probably, 10 or less, or right? So this is amazing, right? She has a Russian defector. They talked about this. Mm-hmm. This was an object of discussion. After the assassination, Ruth Payne, out of Dallas, Irving, Texas, technically, is called in front of the Warren Commission to give her testimony because she's a crucial person in all of this. I read through all of her testimony, In the very first interview she's doing in front of the Warren people, the Warren Commission. Who's on the Warren Commission? Allen Dulles, right? Former head of the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Allen Dulles is sitting there, probably smoking his pipe during the whole thing. Ruth Paine starts to talk about her trip up to Philadelphia to meet Arthur Young. Allen Dulles cuts her off immediately. If you read the transcript, it's obvious. She's starting to talk about this trip. He cuts her off. He makes a few jokes, and he totally sidetracks the entire conversation. We never hear about her trip to Philadelphia. We never hear Arthur Young mentioned. We never hear what she was doing up there. We never hear what was discussed. Allen Dulles made sure of that.
Wow.
Why was this so? Well, as it turns out, Arthur Young's wife, Ruth Young, her best friend was Allen Dulles' mistress. Known her for years. They were best friends together for a long time. Dulles knew what was going on in the Arthur Young household. You know, there couldn't have been no doubt about that he knew something really explosive was involved here, and he made sure that Ruth Paine did not discuss it in front of the Warren Commission. And she never did. And she hasn't since. She has not discussed what happened during that vacation to visit Arthur Young. What she discussed about Lee and Marina, and how she came back down, got Lee the job at the Texas School Book Depository, and the rest is history. But here was the 9 in operation, you know.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating connection, and so many people have studied the JFK conspiracy, and you very rarely hear about this really interesting connection with the 9. And if these people were supposed to be kind of soldiers of these entities' agendas, do we see the threads go out to any other events besides this interesting connection to the JFK thing?
Well, I mean, the JFK has more connections back to the 9, actually, which are also, you know, completely unbelievable. I mean, just the fact that George de Mohrenschildt was a friend of one of the famous mushroom scientists, a guy called Wasson, who was on the trail of the magic mushroom in Mexico. Wasson was reporting back specifically and directly to Andrija Puharich, the leader of the 9, on the experiments that he was doing in Mexico with the mushrooms. In fact, he was supposed to be conducting psychic telekinesis and ESP, experiments during his time in Mexico, back to Andrija Puharich, who was then still in Maine. There was supposed to be this conversation going back and forth telepathically or something, which Wasson screwed up because he got totally stoned on mushrooms, which is understandable, I guess.
Right.
But anyway, so Wasson goes back, and this whole idea of psychedelic mushrooms, of psilocybin, and all of this becomes a major issue. He has a full-page, photographic spread in Life magazine, and all of this. Wasson becomes the guru of magic mushrooms. His name, address, phone number was in George de Mohrenschildt's address book when he committed suicide, when he was getting ready to testify in front of the House Subcommittee on Assassinations, right? So evidently, according to the story, he committed suicide with a shotgun, and they found his address book, and Wasson's name was in it, which indicates a connection back to the 9 with de Mohrenschildt, who also, of course, was involved as some kind of a confidential informant for CIA and everything else. And most recently, in the Hitler Legacy, I talk about this. I found this very strange coincidence as well, that de Mohrenschildt, when he was in Yugoslavia in the 1950s, was accused of spying for American intelligence, but he was there under the aegis of the forerunner of the U.S. AID program, which was a strange little operation that was created by John Foster Dulles, which was supposedly an international aid operation operating out of the State Department, but which functioned as a front for CIA or intelligence activities in other parts of the world. George de Mohrenschildt was involved with that, and it seems as though there were connections back to Oswald, connections back to a couple of other very unsavory people that I researched in Asia, who were also part of the same operation. So there's a lot of very strange stuff going on there. But then there's the other coincidence, the one that I couldn't believe, really, when I came across it. And I had to read it a few times to think maybe I was seeing things or imagining things. And I wasn't. It doesn't make sense even to this day if we think in purely linear terms. where space-time is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that there was a Belgian mystic who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, 100 years ago. And his name was Maeterlinck, Maurice Maeterlinck. He wrote a number of novels. He wrote plays. He was involved with Stanislavski in Moscow. Stanislavski, of course, invented the famous method of method acting. And he wrote a play called The Cloud That Lifted. It's a play that's probably never been performed in the United States, or maybe it was once or something. It was not one of his most popular plays. And in The Cloud That Lifted, he writes about the assassination of a political leader, about the number of shots that were fired, which nobody could really recall how many bullets were actually fired. The bullets were fired from a grassy knoll in front of this political leader. And it was fired by a guy whose name was Alec and who might have been working for Russia. All of these details are in a play that was published before John F. Kennedy was even born.
Wow.
It prefigured the entire assassination, even to the point that Alec is mentioned because Alec Hidell was Lee Harvey Oswald's alias. That's how he bought the rifle that he allegedly used to shoot the president. He was Alec, and he was called Alec in Russia when he was a defector living in Russia. So the whole thing is prefigured in this play, written by a guy who was a mystic, by the way, who believed in astrology and mysticism and seances and all the rest of it, and won the Nobel Prize to boot. Here was a guy who also wrote a play about the bluebird of happiness. You know, this idea of the bluebird of happiness, this concept comes from him. And in his play, which is really strange, and they did make a film out of that with Jane Fonda, among other people, there was this, there were these kids, and they're going on a trip to find the bluebird of happiness. They're going through the forest, and they're encountering all sorts of strange people. But the idea of political conspiracy is in this story. The idea of mind control, of altering reality is all there. And then, of course, we have Operation Bluebird, which was the beginning of the United States mind control, MK Ultra style experiments on behavior control, mind control, brainwashing, and all the rest of it. It was called Bluebird. I think that's quite deliberate. I think it was a deliberate reference to the Maeterlinck play. And if that is so, did they also use The Cloud That Lifted as a template for the assassination of the president?
Man, yeah, that is so weird. And we do see it time and time again, also with that story you mentioned at the beginning of the show, these strange syncs between media and art and real-life events. Another case of it would be with the sinking of the Titanic and the book that was written earlier about the Titan.
Yep.
I mean, the story is almost the same, and the name, the Titan, you couldn't really get much closer.
Sure.
And I know we're getting down to the wire here. Another thing I'm curious about, and I know better than to flat out ask you about your own experiences with ceremonial magic or rituals or the Necronomicon, but you have talked about paranormal experiences as a teenager that validated there being something else in the world. Is there any advice you can give to listeners who are interested and accept these kind of ideas intellectually but haven't ever interacted with it on a personal level? Any thoughts on how to best coax out an interaction of some type?
Wow. Let me think for a second.
Sure.
The importance is this. I think Israel Regardie, who was another one of Crowley's subjects, you might say, one of the people who worked with Crowley a great deal, had this to say. He said that before you embark on a program like this, it's good to spend a couple of years in therapy first. And there's a reason for that. He wasn't being glib. He actually meant it. And he meant it because you don't know what your motivations are for wanting to experience the paranormal, and you don't know what your vulnerabilities are. You don't know what might happen if you have an experience that is so far outside the realm of the norm that it could, conceivably unhinge you, could make you a little crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's very good advice. I think people who are drawn to this subject might be drawn to it for some of the wrong reasons. And wrong is a judgmental word, and it's not really the way I want to put it out there. But it could be because of a vulnerability in your own psyche that you're trying to redress without really knowing about it. This is very potent emotional and psychological material, or it can be. In fact, in the best way, it can be. But it means that you're going to be taking risks and playing a little bit fast and loose with your own consciousness. And if you're not really strong psychologically, it could be enough to tip you over. You could become obsessive. There have been, even Crowley writes about cases where people have become obsessive by studying magic, and all kinds of wrong things have happened. I've known people, that's happened to, that they get involved in this thing and they think that suddenly they have the secrets to the universe, but at the same time they're being pursued by, faceless demons who want to eat them. And, that does exist in a theoretical sense, but it can be handled, it can be dealt with. But when the fear reactions start to take over, then you lose objectivity and you lose power over your own mind. And that's the thing you really want to avoid. I think it's something you go into gradually. Mm-hmm. I was a kid when this happened. There was no idea of going into anything gradually when you're a kid, when you're a teenager.
Right.
And so you just sort of go into it, and you don't know. You had no teachers. You had nobody to tell you what to do. And you have these experiences. And in a sense, I wish I didn't have them. If I had not had them, I probably would have led a pretty normal life up till now. But it was having them while I was in high school, and then going into high school and studying chemistry and biology and physics, in a high school academic program, and realizing the two things didn't match, that basically made me question everything. And questioning everything is not a comfortable place to be if you want to progress in society. You've got to buy into a program and stick with it, right? You've got to become an insurance salesman or something. And that door was closed to me once I had these experiences. As much as I try to ignore them at some times and forget about them, it was still there. I saw things that should not happen, that should not really exist. And that is what led me into understanding there were secrets, and there were other people like me who might have had the same experiences or something similar, who then pursued this study much more aggressively than I did, and maybe in a different context, maybe in a military context or a political one or a scientific one. So it made me realize that there are people out there with some shared experiences who look at the world in a different way. And should we be afraid of these people? And I'm still not 100% sure on that, and I can't give you an ultimate answer. We should be afraid of some of them. Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
And some of them maybe not, and some of them, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, definitely good points. I'm super interested, but until you've had like a personal experience, it's hard to fully pull these things out of mythology and superstition.
Sure.
And that's definitely why I'm curious, but you're right. Who knows the deep down reason I might be curious. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I might be being subtly possessed into developing an interest.
There you go.
Who knows?
But it could be a very human interest. I mean, this is part of who we are. Remember, Julian Jaynes wrote a book called about the bicameral mind a long time ago. Perhaps you don't remember. It was very big at the time, very controversial. And he said that human consciousness developed when we learned to shut off one half of our brain. That at one point, as we evolved as hominids, the two halves of the brain were having a conversation. And one half of our brain was the half that we thought we were listening to God talk, right? Yeah. Telling us to do this and to do that. And eventually with evolution, we shut down that part of the brain, or we integrated it so much that we no longer hear it. So it was a kind of schizophrenia.
Wow.
That the human race lived in a state of schizophrenia for a long time, which is why we never progressed, until we learned to shut down one half of the brain that we could concentrate on other things. So it's probably hardwired into us, this listening to the voices of angels and gods and seeing visions and all the rest of it, which is what one half of our brain does. We've learned to sort of channel it into art or something else, but that wasn't a complete cure. That didn't solve the problem completely. And those of us who are very much involved, in the arts and in creative work may have inadvertently opened those channels, which is what Lovecraft was writing about.
Wow. Yeah. I love that perspective. And with these things, of course, you're right. It's important to approach with caution. We do hear a lot of horror stories. Same with psychedelics, really. I mean, some people consider them to be enlightening versus mind melting. Some people never come back. They just become burnouts from the same chemicals that other people attribute to wisdom and enlightenment.
Sure.
And that, an example of that we really didn't get to talk about is MK Ultra. And I like how you consider that time period, the things that were going on under that umbrella, as forced ritual initiation. I never considered it that way, but it really was forced initiation without the safeguards and in complete ignorance in a lot of cases.
Precisely. And then we sent those people out onto the street. You know? Man. And we wonder why, you know.
Yeah, and that has all kinds of threads too. But wow, this has been amazing, man. You are such a wealth of information, and you've written about so much that it's tough to even scratch the surface here. We didn't even talk about wandering bishops, but hopefully we can do this again sometime, you know?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Awesome. And before I really cut you loose, can you remind the people about some of your books they can pick up, your website, anything else you're working on?
Sure. You can go. I have a website, peterlevenda.com. I don't update it that often. I'm deeply involved in a big project right now that I have to finish as soon as I can. And it's like another Sinister Forces project, basically. So I don't update the stuff as much as I could. But you can get information on peterlevenda.com. When Amazon, of course, has all the books. I mean, it has the Nazi books, the Dark Lord, which is the Kenneth Grant book that you mentioned, as well as other books I've written on Freemasons and on the Mormons and other things as well. So it's all there. I've written books on Tantra. I just came out with a book called The Tantric Alchemist, which is an investigation of alchemy and basically decoding European alchemical texts in light of psychobiology and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of stuff I've been working on. And my last name is spelled Levenda, Levenda. People will spell it L-A and get totally confused when they find some other guy. So just thought I'd reiterate that. But
sure.
Yeah, my books are on, of course, on Amazon, all the usual suspects, Barnes and Noble, and places like that.
Right on. Awesome stuff, man. I really enjoyed it. And as a lazy stoner and college dropout, I have so much respect for you and all the research you've done. You're one of the greats, man. Take care of yourself out there.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
You got it. Wow, guys.